to go into the discussion, you guys, because Christian fundamentalism is taking another is on the rise, and there's always been a complex relationship between faith and freedom in the Black community. The same Bible that says "obey your earthly masters" also inspired Nat Turner to rebel against those masters. Today, there's an exodus from the church simultaneously as Christian fundamentalism is on the rise. Now, as mental health crises spike, are Black folks healing in the pews? Are they breaking free from them? So tonight, we're going to talk about what the church is doing, the rise of Black atheism and spirituality versus scripture. We have the one and only Mandisa Thomas here, and she is the president of Black Nonbelievers. You guys get in tune with them on Instagram right now at B Nonbelievers Inc. And we're going to have some really life-changing discussions today. Talk about the white savior complex and so much more. You guys tune in. Call-in number is 470-572-7678. We're going in tonight. So how did you become an atheist? Because, coming from a Black, I'm assuming, American Black household, um, that the church is always like a big dominant factor in a lot of households. You know, whether it's even just like the grandma's presence. The parents may not be into it like that, but the grandma sets this tone. So it's a lot that's in the Black community as far as the church or the mosque or some sort of, one of the three Abrahamic religions sort of thing. So how did you become a Black atheist?
Yeah, so first, I'd like to thank you for having me on your show. It is an absolute pleasure and honor to be here and to discuss my background as well as the very, very important subject matter because it's very important. So I was born and raised in New York City. I born and raised in Southside Jamaica, Queens, for all my fellow New Yorkers. And I was born in 1976, and I don't mind dating myself. So I'm sure you can remember there's always been iterations in Black communities that were really cultural specific and that were very focused on like awareness, like societal awareness, and also that rebelled against what was considered societal norms. And so being born in the 70s, which was a very, very pivotal time in Black communities, and New York was no different. My parents, in particular, my father grew up. His my father's mother is extremely religious. He was basically forced to go to church. He hated it, and so and my on my mother's side, even though my grandparents were sort of raised in the church, yeah, it was my maternal grandmother who provided like earliest memories and the background of pretty much like not necessarily being raised fully religious. So I remember we would celebrate Thanksgiving every year. There was never any prayer. Now I did have some Christian family members on that side and some Muslim family members, some who were part of the Nation of Islam, some and others who were just like, they just, it was more about the family being together rather than it just, being centered around one particular belief. However, growing up and, being born in the 70s, growing up in the 80s, I was raised in the Black conscious community. So a lot of things I see here are very, very familiar to me. I know that my aunt is means truth. And so I was raised in, my brothers and I frequently attended a cultural center called the African Poetry Theater. And I give the shout outs to the elders there because I learned so much about Black history and culture, institutional racism and injustice that was committed against our people and other marginalized groups. And so one of the things I learned early on was how Christianity in particular enslaved our ancestors. And that stuck with me. And also the imagery of white Jesus and how that has contributed to so much anti-Blackness, and pretty much what you could consider as a psychosis in our communities. And that just it really, really stuck. And learning all of that information, my brothers and I growing up, it was a lot to take in, but we knew it was very important. And also, I'm a classically trained singer, and so I would perform with my voice instructor at various churches in the in Queens and over in the New York City area. And whenever I sat in those excuse me, what are they? In those sermons, the pews and the sermons and and the services, excuse me. I don't know how that escaped me. I would, I remember the preachers telling people to turn to this part of the Bible and such, and I was just like, it was a lot of just like regurgitation of information and just probably like call and response. And it wasn't much in the way of like education and information. And I was trying to wrap my head around like the Trinity concept of God, or at least a Christian God. And something about it just always never sat right. And again, having learned and having a basis in like Black history and culture and that information and education, I remember comparing and contrasting a lot of that growing up. And I read different forms of mythology. I read Greek mythology, Norse mythology, some African mythology. And I actually had the opportunity to go to Ghana on a youth group trip when I was a teenager, when I was 14. And so it was to try to make a very, very long story short, it was a combination of experiencing aspects of my family, looking at seeing very much hypocrisy in both sides of my family, but also what I learned. You talking about the Muslim and the Christian side? All of them, all of it, all of it. Everything. Yeah. Everybody being a hypocrite. There were a lot of things that just weren't. They were very contradictory, and even some of the things that I would very suspect, very much so, and it was very much the information and the education that I received, the things that I learned growing up. I was made aware of all of, especially like the Black conscious scholars, like Dr. John Henry Clark, Dr. Ben, Dr. Van Sertima, Chancellor Williams, The Destruction of Black Civilization, all of those, the Black book, right? That if you were raised in the Black conscious community, these are books that are familiar to you. And so it really was, and just being ingrained with the knowledge of historic and iconic Black folks that went beyond the church. Learning about all the famous Black inventors, scientists, doctors, lawyers, and then also learning about history from the continent of Africa that went beyond the enslavement. So, we learned about, the various, kings and queens, and African civilizations before the transatlantic slave trade. So it was all of that combined with my love for reading, combined with the having and a root, my childhood being rooted in like critical thought, like questioning things, and just being exposed to so many different aspects and cultures growing up in New York. And when I really, really thought about all of it, like when I became an adult, the first time I said I was an atheist was when I was 14, because one of my classmates in high school asked, was I an atheist? And I asked, well, what does that mean? And I was told that you don't believe in heaven or hell. And the more I thought about it, I said, well, that sounds about right, because I could never reconcile this idea of heaven or hell when I was younger. It would actually keep me up at night, where I was like, well, where do we go when we die? Like what happens? There's no evidence of a heaven or hell. And I would also think about that whenever I would attend funerals. And also when you learn about the injustices and the atrocities that have been committed against our ancestors, I'm like, you mean to tell me that there's a loving God that, there's a God that loves our people, but has allowed all this suffering? And so those types of things, again, stuck with me.
Well, hold on. I want you to hold that thought.
Yes.
I want you to hold that thought real quick. Because speaking of hell, a lot of people say you'll be going to hell with wearing this shirt you got on right now.
Oh yeah,
So like, you gotta stand up and let them see it. You gotta see
absolutely.
Instagram.
So shout out to, I want to give a quick shout out to Edith Gray, our co-host for our YouTube show In the Cut. She's also a yeah, sure. So for those of you who are on Instagram, read it and weep. If you're gonna weep, that's fine. It says Jesus was thrown under the bus so that God could get clout. And this directly relates to the crucifixion. And, there are many aspects of the Bible. Now, I will say for myself, having not really been raised like as a Christian. So I had a very pluralistic upbringing. I was raised around Christians, raised around Muslims, raised around 5%ers, raised around people in the nation. But I will say that for those who are very, very entrenched in the church, and again, just thinking about the whole, the like I said, the Trinity concept of God, and also the crucifixion, which is a horrific story. It's a very, very horrific story, and there's also a passage in, during the crucifixion, Jesus asked, Father, why hast thou forsaken me? So it really calls into question. And I know we can get back to how I became an atheist in a moment, but this is just one of those things, right? Yeah. You have to ask yourself the question of, if this is an all-powerful, all-knowing God, why is Jesus asking his Father, who is God, why hast thou forsaken me? If Jesus is God, if he's the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I mean,
I don't think it's murky.
It does.
Jesus is God. God is Jesus. And it's like the Trinity is one person.
Right. So it's like, is he trying to save himself? Is it a different entity?
It gets very murky.
And
it gets very confusing. And then, there are passages in the Bible, the most empowering passages, the most provocative passages that the church still doesn't talk about, that were left out. They rebranded it Slave Bible. Got your niggers on the field. But we're going to talk about that. You guys got to tune in to rawfortv.tv. It's about to be explosive, empowering, entertaining, yet life-changing discussion right here. Is religion leading Black people back into slavery? We're going to talk about that with Mandisa Thomas. You guys definitely need to tune in. We're going to get off text. We're going to get off YouTube. We're going to get off Facebook. We're going to get off Instagram, because you're not going to see this anywhere else. Call in 470-572-7678. Comments or questions. Yes, but the revolution will not be televised. It's Too Raw for TV. TooRawForTV.tv.
Just get that air horn sound. We are trying to get.
Yeah, great. But we're going in about this. We're talking about, is religion leading Black people back into slavery? Oh my God. These black people, man, they are out of control right now.
I mean,
Like, now here's my thing like this, because I know, okay, you do certain things that are outside of the black person box.
mm-hmm.
You know, that's anything outside of white Jesus or anything out of Islam. It's almost like they have to ask you again. So it's like,
Sure.
what God do you believe in?
None of them.
Okay, what God do you believe in? What God do you believe in, though? What do you believe in? That, you know what I'm saying? It's like,
sure.
we hit that middle block, like almost like
Yeah.
when I was fasting, I fasted from solid food for close to 3 years.
Yeah.
One day.
Okay.
Protest.
Yeah.
Mock, not mock, but a symbolic hunger strike.
Uh-huh.
And it's like, people like, okay, so what do you eat though? I'm like, I'm trying to explain that I'm drinking and, you know, existing liquids, but it's not computing.
Right.
You
Yeah.
get that a lot, like somebody asks you,
Atheism
like
what? Yeah.
So they're like, what do you believe in? What do you believe in?
Oh yes, we get that a lot. So,
Okay.
or it's just an assumption that we believe in nothing, and I will definitely explain more of that for sure.
We're going in tonight. We have Mandisa Thomas, and what I want to do, I'm opening up the phone lines 470-572-7678. We're going in tonight. But what I want to do is I want to talk about the impact of Black Christian church culture.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
Because to me, I don't have any problems with the religion per se. I have a problem with the culture that the religion produces and why it's not, there's certain things. We got the biggest gangsters, the biggest child sex predators, the biggest hypocrites come from Bible thumping black church. We got to be 100% real with this. Like that's what the black church produces, and I'm not saying that the black church doesn't produce any great people, but it does. But as far as a collective culture, it's almost like it's just a scared to go to hell gang. We're scared to go to hell gang, and it's like that because they do everything else, and then on Sunday it's in the church and asking for forgiveness and all this stuff. So what's your thoughts on that?
Yes, so I definitely would like to say that I appreciate all aspects of Black history and culture. And with that being said, it is important for us to acknowledge the fact that the church, or the Black church as we know it to be now as a collective, was really became a safe haven from um, when many enslaved folks or formerly enslaved folks were kept out of white churches, right? And so there are some denominations of Black churches that, like the AME Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, that was founded by Richard Allen, that incorporates aspects of like some African traditions, and that is definitely more Afrocentric or Black centered. Not all Black churches are like that. And I think it's important that for people to remember, or if you never knew, that of course the traditional cultures or religions that the enslaved that the captives were when they were brought over, primarily from West Africa, they were stripped of those. They were not allowed to practice them. And so, but there were some enslaved who were allowed to retain some of that culture. And so, much of the Black church, I would say, can be like in its earlier iterations, was a bit of rebellion. It was to identify, in many ways. And be that community source. And I know that there are documentaries on this, like the history of the Black church and what it meant for many of our ancestors and elders here in the United States. And so, with that being said, it doesn't change the doctrine of Christianity as you know, and it does not, especially the big three, the Judeo-Christian religions, which, as many of us know, are very similar and are based off of each other. Like Christianity, as we know, now is an offshoot of Judaism. Islam is an offshoot of Christianity. And so, and much of it is rooted in, like I said, enslavement and subjugation. And so I think for as much as the Black church has provided as far as a sense of community and culture, and also being able to help folks at a time when you could not depend on the federal government, when there were laws that effectively disfranchised our communities. The mental aspect, you asked about if religion or the Black church is sending us back into slavery, and I contend that it never stopped.
No, slavery never stopped.
I would say mental enslavement, because slavery in the United States was technically outlawed in the early 1800s, but the slave trade was outlawed. But then, they were still bringing in slaves like through Louisiana and places like that. But when slavery was technically banned or made illegal in like the 1860s, there were other ways to enslave or to perpetuate enslavement through Jim Crow laws, through not denying the 40 acres and a mule, denying that reparations. And so to pretty much keep Black folks dependent, even though, and we've never really been that whole, well, we just want, I definitely don't like to put us in that box that we've never resisted, because we have. Oh, yeah. What I have a problem with many in our communities is that aspect of the history seems to be overlooked in favor of this belief in this God, and especially this Christian God that many people think led us to freedom. And it's like, no, not at all. So I think that, yes, it is part of like you said, the history is very, very important to look into and to read about and to watch, like in documentary form. But I do think also that, like with many denominations, which there are some folks who may not even think that they're in a cult, but when your community, or when your church or your particular denomination teaches you not to question, it encourages you not to look outside of that belief, or look outside of what that leader is saying, that is cult-like. That is very much a cult. And that describes many denominations of religion and Christianity.
I would say this too. Doesn't that describe America as a whole?
Oh, absolutely.
Look at all of that. I mean, it was very cultish. I mean, there was, and especially when you're talking about before, and we're going to talk about that, because I want to talk about science. So it's going to get to the middle. We're going to talk about.
Sure. Yeah.
So I mean, like, the science, like people just, as when 2020 hit, government started just barking out orders to people, just like based on science. Now I know science does appeal to a lot of people that are in the community that are it's like but what is the science? You know what I'm saying? What is the science? It was came out to be fraudulent science, that the whole 2020 thing. You know what I'm saying?
You mean with COVID?
Yeah.
Well, we can let's dive into that, right? So first of all, there are many different disciplines of science, and there is a scientific method.
Yeah.
The basis is a hypothesis. Then you test it, and then you come to a conclusion. Sometimes those conclusions may differ from my hypothesis. Science as a methodology and as a discipline is not supposed to resolve itself in being right. Mm-hmm. And I think where we mess up as a people, mm-hmm, is that, because, as a history enthusiast, we have to be honest about how practitioners of science did not, there is such a thing as scientific racism, right? There were practitioners of science who definitely did not do so for, in the best interest of our people.
Well, I would say that, mm-hmm, all Western medicine is based on scientific racism. You have all of the vaccines and stuff that have the Henrietta Lacks.
Yes, there is a history of they utilize
especially with black women.
Right, but let me
mutilation of black women's bodies, all of that stuff with no anesthesia. Right. The fathers of Western medicine that done that.
Right. Now, you can look through many historical, not even just in the United States, mm-hmm, but there were many medical procedures that, especially back then, that were not in the best interest of human beings. And yes, during that time of enslavement and us not being seen as people, yes, there were definitely practitioners of science, mm-hmm, who abused people like Henrietta Lacks and others. I think it's important for us to be honest about the history of that, while also